This is Olivia Green interviewing Dean Jacqueline Jones for the HBCU Radio Preservation Project. It is currently 10:08 a.m. on Tuesday, December 16th, 2025, and this interview is being recorded remotely. Before I get into the questions, Dean Jones, can you please just state your full name for me and what your relationship is to WEAA?
Okay. I would prefer Jackie instead of Jacqueline, just to be on the record. Jackie, Jones, Jones. And I'm the Dean of the School of Global Journalism and Communication, which is where WEAA is housed, and it's under the auspices of the School of Global Journalism and Communication.
Thank you so much, and thanks again for making the time to be here this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, so first, can you tell me when and where you were born?
Washington, D.C. in 1954, August of 1954.
Okay, and if somebody did not have any context, how would you describe what it was like to grow up in DC at that time? What did it sound like? What did it smell like? What were you focused on as a young person?
It was more a small southern town in a lot of ways than DC as people think of it. I remember as a kid that Congress actually went home for the summer. It was like almost like a state legislature. So there was sort of summers were lighter and freer because there was less traffic and all of that kind of stuff. And somewhere around the Nixon years, I just remember them being here more. They were here year round, and it kind of changed the flow of the city. But it was. This will give you an idea of what it was like when I was growing up. In the summer, men would wear seersucker suits and straw boaters, those hats, with the little band around them. That wasn't uncommon in DC at the time. It was not a good restaurant city. There were only a few places to go. And a lot of people didn't going out to eat was not a regular thing like it is today. That was a special occasion kind of thing. We were probably in the last vestiges of segregation when I was a kid. And I didn't know until later because my parents always made it seem like where we were going or what we were going to do was going to be far more fun than some other part of town. And so I can remember, going out and seeing people sitting in restaurants or at lunch counters, and I'd say, can we go get a hot dog? Or can my mother say, I cook way better than those people. We'll just wait and eat when we get home. And part of it may have been financial, but the other part was she wasn't going to risk going in somewhere and being turned down for being Black. I do have a vague recollection of where we could shop in downtown DC. So for people that don't know DC, it's built on a grid, kind of north, south, east, west. And the letter streets are downtown in Northwest DC. And G Street was where Black people shopped. The stores along G Street were fine from 7th Street to about 13th Street. Nobody shopped on 14th Street downtown. There was a section uptown, kind of Mount Pleasant, Adams Morgan area neighborhoods where that section of 14th Street was sort of the F Street was off limits, and there tended to be sort of the more upscale stores, and you definitely didn't shop at, I remember 14th and F was a store called Garfinkel's, GARFINKEL''S. And we didn't even think to go over there. It was, that kind of thing. And so I remember the transition when we could begin to shop on F Street. And I was, probably 7th, 8th grade. Still unusual to see a lot of people, Black people shopping over on F Street. I remember my dad telling me when he came back from the Korean War, he went to Garfinkel's to try to buy an overcoat, and he was turned away from the store. Um, and, he felt some kind of way about that because he had gone to fight for his country and came back and couldn't shop where he wanted to shop. And I just remember as a young teenager going into Garfinkel's, and this was my way of getting back. I started looking at stuff, and I asked to try on a whole bunch of stuff and really ate up a lot of the sales clerk's time, knowing full well I wasn't going to buy a thing in the store. And after I tried on several outfits, I said, "Oh, I don't see anything I want," and I left the store. And I'm sure she, in her head, was calling me a whole sack of names, but I felt like that was my small victory. So, yeah, I went to Catholic school from first to 12th grade. Neither school exists anymore. The buildings are still there, but the schools, the programs, they're shut down. In the 80s, I guess, 80s, 90s, a lot of Catholic high schools closed or merged with other schools just because of lack of enrollment. The school where I went to grade school became a charter school, but the church still owns, the parish church still owns the building. So, people still have special events in the church hall and that kind of stuff, and class reunions and things like that. So that's still there. And I don't attend there regularly anymore, but weddings, funerals, any kind of special occasions, I usually go. I was just there a couple of weeks ago. The last dad of the dads I remember growing up passed away, and it was the church was packed. It was a large family. He had 7 kids, and back then, if you were going, if you went to a school like St. Gabriel's, and there was somebody in your class, and that person had siblings, if you had a lot of siblings, probably your younger brothers or your older brothers and sisters, a lot of large Catholic families at that time. And there was a group of fathers who were active in the men's club, Knights of Columbus. At some point we got a credit union. They were involved in it. Just all of those things. The scout troop, all of that kind of stuff. And so you knew certain parents were super active in church, and so they were kind of as we always joke about, brothers from another mother and sisters from another mister. You just kind of you knew that if for whatever reason your parents weren't around, somebody's parents were around, and they just kind of looked out for us. If they saw us going somewhere or doing something inappropriate, you knew by the time you got home, your folks knew. And there was no way you were going to tell your parents that anybody else's parent lied on you. That just didn't happen. And so we all had stories to tell, and it was a good reunion, but these folks really had a lot of impact on how we grew up. And I remember the mothers would get together like on the phone to say, okay, all the moms got on the phone to decide when we could start wearing hosiery. And so they decided that Easter of 6th grade would be when we could wear stockings to church. Mm-hmm. And then we had to get permission for other special occasions. They all got together to determine what would be the appropriate age for single dating. Otherwise, we were always doing stuff in groups, and that was how life was. Your folks helped pick your playmates and the folks you hung out with. And I don't know that anybody complained about it. You might chafe a little bit, but it just wasn't that big a deal. House parties were big. Wasn't a lot of nightclub life back in the day. So then when we started going to clubs, Friday night was club night and Saturday was house party night. And you would just go all over town. We would have a list of parties, and we would just go, and we'd say, okay, there's the party is a girl named Olivia is having the party. we'd show up at your house and knock on the door. And my friends and I, we had a little plan because most girls never knew enough boys to have enough guys at the party because they all had girlfriends, right? And so we would put the guys in front. So when you opened the door, there were boys. So you would let us in. And then we go, if it's a guy, it's like, oh, this is Charles. Okay. We will, they put the girls in front. And so sometimes you would get to the door and somebody would look at you and say, do I know you? And my friend Mike would always look. And if he saw a girl dancing, he'd wave. And then the girl would kind of squint and wave. And then the guy would look over his shoulder and say, oh, you know her? Okay, y'all come in. And that was the way it was. So you knew when it was your turn to host the party, the same rules applied. You didn't tell people they couldn't come in because you didn't know them. They just came in. And most of the time it was uneventful. And I really missed that for my son growing up, that he didn't have that kind of experience where you could just party hop and see people all over the place with, basically no worries that a fight was going to break out or anything like that. So it's probably more than you want to know, but
No, that's really interesting to hear. And I feel like it's reflective of a lot of the stories that we get from people from DC or cities in the mid Atlantic in general at that point in time. Just like, even though you might be kind of on the tail end of segregation and facing all that comes with it, there was a certain level of kind of community connection and care and safety that people seem to find within
Mhm.
themselves and within their direct community, that I think, like, yeah, it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, and you learn how to you learn how to work it, and so you just you knew it wasn't right, but I don't think I ever felt that I wasn't as good as. Um, we went to school, we did what we were supposed to do. Our parents were working hard to see that we would have chances that they didn't have, and that really meant um, a lot for us. And we all a lot of us lived in multi-generational households. And so folks pooled their resources. My brother was 10 years older. And so by the time I was in maybe, when I was in sixth grade, he was in the Army. So by the time I got to high school, he was out working, but still living at home. And um, when I needed something for school, or if money was tight, for tuition or whatever, everybody, my grandmother, my father, my mother, my brother all kicked in to make sure I had what I needed to go to school. And so that was just kind of how it worked. And so I have a godson and I have a son, and well, I have a lot of godchildren, but this particular godson, I should say, and one of his brothers, and my son and my godson's wife all pool money so that when a parent is in trouble or needs support or something, there's a little cushion. And so my godson uh, and I were talking, and I recently had a new HVAC system installed, and he was like, "Why didn't you call me and tell me?" And you know, you don't have to pay for that. We could have done something. And I said, I'm not trying to pick y'all's pockets. I said, you married, you got 4 kids, you just got one out of college, you got another one in, you got 2 more coming behind. I said, I'm not going to do that to y'all. And my son has 2 daughters, one in college, one in high school. And so he said, but that's what we put the money aside for. He said, so if you're getting ready, before you spend the money, you should probably call me, and we'll get together and talk about it and see. We might not be able to do it all for you, but we should have enough to help. And I said, okay. I said, I guess this isn't the time to tell you that I'm also having all my windows replaced. So, and that was a recent conversation. The window guys were here yesterday. So, but I think kind of that taking care of family gets passed on. And I know that some families lose it somewhere along the way. And I really feel bad for folks who go through that because it's so important. My immediate family was small, but I've got a ton of cousins. And, we were all here for Thanksgiving. And one year, one of the younger cousins said, I think we should have healthier food at Thanksgiving. And maybe we should tweak a couple of the recipes in order to, kind of, just do something a little different. And one of the older boys said, we ain't tweaking nothing. We gonna have Thanksgiving like we always do with the recipes, just like grandma made them. If you want to bring something different, help yourself, but don't go messing with the basics. I reminded him of that on Thanksgiving. He cracked it up. So that's my favorite line now. We ain't tweeting nothing.
I think I agree with that. Some things,
Mhm.
especially Thanksgiving food. Mm. But can you tell me a little bit more about your parents? Where were they from? What did they do? What were they like?
Both my parents were born and raised in DC. My father grew up in Adams Morgan neighborhood, which is probably for younger people is more popularly known for clubs and restaurants and places to hang out. It wasn't quite that when he was a kid, but he lived on a street called Calorama Road, and you might have heard of Malcolm X Park. And he was like right down the street from the park, and across the street he grew up in a row house with his parents and two brothers. And right across the street from their house was a roller rink that was popular for many, many years. Calorama Rink was a big deal. And he ultimately became a letter carrier for the post office. And he met my mother because one of his best friends lived around the corner on 17th Street. And one day my mother was visiting her cousins, and she walked up to her cousin and he said, hey, baby, how you doing? She said, I'm fine. I'm just going in to talk to the family. He said, okay. And she kissed him on the cheek and went in the apartment. And my father said, who's that? And he said, that's my cousin. He said, you didn't introduce us? What's up with it? And so when mama left, like, our cousin made the introduction, and that's how my parents got together. So my mother's parents, her mother was born and raised in DC, one of four daughters. And she was a housewife until my mother went to high school and decided to go to work because it was during World War II. And a lot of women were getting jobs then. And her first job was at the Navy Department, and she was an escort. So during the war, visitors had to be escorted to the offices. And so they hired attractive young women who sat in the lobby and waited for visitors to arrive. And then you were assigned to take Admiral so-and-so or whoever to whatever office. And so they did hire Black women. Of course, the ad in the paper said colored girls. But she and one of her friends went down to get jobs. Her friend got a job as an elevator operator, and my grandmother got a job as an escort. And then after the war, she became a key punch operator. And then after that, she was the receptionist in a section called Ship's Reproduction. And it reported to Admiral Rickover, who is known as the father of the nuclear submarine. And so for some reason, Admiral Rickover liked my grandmother. And so every now and then when she had to go to his office to drop off papers or whatever, he'd invite her to sit in his office and tell him how things were going with her job. And if she was having, a rough time, a supervisor was giving her the blues or something, if she told it, by the time she got back down to the office, there was a new attitude. So that was always her standard line when somebody was irritating her last nerve. And she said, don't make me go upstairs to Rickover. She married, my maternal grandfather was a barber. He grew up in DC, but he was born in Columbia, South Carolina. And he was the baby of, I think, it was 9 kids. And his father was a bricklayer, and there was some plague or something going on. And his father died in that. And a number of his older siblings had already moved to DC. So they sent for my great grandmother and my grandfather. And he went to, so they moved to DC in the U Street corridor. And he went to school at Harrison Elementary. And somewhere around here, I have a picture of him in his kindergarten class. And my other grandparents, my father's mother grew up in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Her family worked on a tobacco farm. And she and all her siblings, as soon as they could get away from their picking tobacco, they did, and they all moved to DC. And then my grandfather was born in Springfield, Ohio, and his mother died when he was a toddler. And his father could not keep all of the kids. And so he put them all in an orphanage at first, and then came back and got the oldest boy, and then farmed out the other kids to relatives. And so he was sent to live with his mother's sister. And so they went from Springfield to Dayton to Cleveland. Then they moved to Pittsburgh. And then they came to DC, and all of that happened in a short period of time. So by the time he was 5 or 6, he was growing up in DC. And he worked for, I think, the Labor Department. He was very light-skinned, as was my paternal grandmother. But I think he passed. He never said he did. He never said he didn't. But he got a job at the Labor Department and made fairly decent money for the time. So I think he was employing the don't ask, don't tell policy. And they had my uncle, and then my father was a fraternal twin. They had my father and my other uncle, and they grew up in that house on Calorama Road. And then at some point, my grandfather bought another house in a neighborhood called Bloomingdale in Northeast DC. And he and my grandmother moved there. But by then, my father and his brothers were grown men. And so my father's twin stayed in the house, and his wife and stepdaughter, he got married, and his wife and stepdaughter lived in that house. When my parents got married, they lived in Northeast DC as well, in an apartment. And then when I was about 3, my parents split up. And so they never divorced. They were separated. And we went to live with my maternal grandparents, who had just bought a house in the Petworth neighborhood of DC in Northwest. And that's where I grew up. My mother had been married previously. And so my brother was from her first marriage. And so we all lived there together. And then my parents were kind of off and on. It was like breaking up, get back together, break it again. So I just remember it being there were times when it was just kind of weird for me. And by the time I was in about maybe the 6th or 7th grade, I was just like, I was over it. I wanted them to choose. Stay, go. Either way is fine. But and I'll tell you this quick story. This was kind of funny. There was something I wanted to do. And for a lot of kids, even when your parents are together, you always try to pit them against each other, right? So you ask mom, she says no, you go ask dad, he says yes, and you're hoping that will prevail. So my father this was during one of the separation periods, and my dad came by, and my mother was standing there, and I said, I really want to do X. And my father said, okay, you can do that. Go ahead. And I looked at my mother, and then I didn't move. And my father said, well, I told you, yes. Why are you still standing there? And I looked at him. I said, because I got to live with her. And so, but they really did love each other. They just didn't know how to navigate that space because they had too many people in their ears. We got those families that are well-intentioned, but they all have too much advice for you. And they didn't quite know how to tell them to mind their business. And so it took a while, but they did eventually reconcile for good. So it all worked out.
So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the issues that people were thinking about and talking about while you were growing up in DC before you got to college. Kind of what public affairs conversations were happening in your home. I'm wondering if you remember or were part of any protests or community actions as a young person.
No. My family was extremely cautious. They weren't going to go anywhere or do anything that they thought could get them in trouble, that might involve the police. They had friends who did. My grandmother's best friend did she took the 1963 March on Washington. And I just remember my mother and my grandmother like checking the TV to see if there were news bulletins or what was going on because they were worried about her safety. And then after the march, she came by the house and she was like elated. She heard King speak. She was just like, oh, it was wonderful. There were all these people. Everybody was so nice to each other. And she was just going on and on about it. But she was really active, in civic stuff, but nobody in my immediate family was. My father didn't even vote when he got the chance because he said it didn't matter who was in office because everybody needed their mail. And so he just didn't, he didn't engage. In DC, you couldn't vote for president until 1964. And so I do remember that. I remember my mother and my grandmother getting dressed up to go to vote. Like they were dressed like they were going to church. And my grandfather voted. I guess by then, 64 was 10. So my brother wasn't quite old enough to vote in that election because the voting age then was 21. And there was nothing to vote for locally because the district was run by a 3-member commission and they were appointed. And it was there was a Black man on the commission named John Duncan. And many years later, when I was in college, I went to George Washington University. A friend and I went and interviewed Duncan about what being on the commission was like for the school paper. And I had he talked about often being the deciding vote because there would be the split, because one guy was more conservative and the other guy was more liberal, and he was kind of smack in the middle as a moderate. And in the interview, he said, when the issue was about something that I really thought would benefit the district, he said, what I knew for sure when we would have these commission meetings is that 2 white boys weren't going to agree with each other on anything. And so whoever was voting on the side that he thought was most beneficial was where his vote went. By the time I was in, I guess, near the end of high school, we got the non-voting delegate to Congress, and Walter Fauntleroy was the first delegate. And I was writing a story for the school paper, and his opponent was this white attorney named John Nevius, who was very nice, invited me to his office, gave me a lot of time, talked to me maybe for an hour. And Fauntleroy wouldn't give me an interview. Nobody in this office would schedule an interview or any of that. So I wrote the story and noted in the story that I couldn't get an interview or a response of any kind of statement, anything from his office. And one of my classmates' mother had a copy of the story when Fauntleroy came through to visit her office, to try to get people to, he was basically campaigning. And so she showed him the story and he looked kind of stunned. And he said, well, I'll tell your daughter to have her classmate call my office and we'll set up an appointment. And he wrote down the name and said, have it. But by then it was too late. That was like the last issue for the school year. And Fauntleroy won. I mean, it was a landslide. But, he turned out to be a pretty good delegate, and being not having a vote on the floor of Congress, you had to do a lot of negotiating. You had to, but you could vote in committee. And that was sort of the advantage. So if you're on the House DC subcommittee or on the committee and they needed your vote for something, then you could negotiate, okay, I will vote for this if you will do this for DC. And so a lot of things that were granted to the district at the time were based on building those kinds of relationships. And so a lot of it was just trying to figure out who your allies were in the House of Representatives. And then eventually we were able to vote for the school board. And then I was in college when home rule passed. And so we went from having an appointed mayor, which happened after the riots, I'll come back to that in a minute, to having an elected mayor and a city council. And to greater or lesser degrees over time, I'll put it that way. Home rule gave the city some autonomy, but we never had full autonomy under home rule. It was everything was and still is to some degree controlled by the House of Representatives. If they didn't like a rule that was passed or if a policy or a law, they could withhold funding. There were always ways that they could punish us, and even with the non-voting delegate. Sometimes the delegate has vote in committee. Sometimes the delegate does not, depending on the whims and caprice of the House, and the rules will go back and forth. So right now, the delegate has committee votes, but there have been times when she had no vote at all. So that was problematic. It's been obviously more aggressive against the city since with the current presidential administration. But they control everything, because our mayor is just that. She's a mayor. She's not a governor. She can't call in the National Guard. She can request that the Guard be sent, but she cannot order. So when the January 6th riots went down, it was clear that Capitol Police needed assistance. Metropolitan Police were not allowed to go onto the Capitol grounds. They couldn't go on federal property in a law enforcement capacity unless they were asked to come. And so Mayor Bowser got a lot of blame in those early days after the riot for not sending help to the Capitol Police, but they couldn't go. They had not sent an invitation. I think they didn't know how overwhelmed they were going to be in those early moments. And so by the time they realized they needed help, they had to get somebody else in Maryland or Virginia, and one of those governors, to order National Guard. But there was that whole process. They had to go and ask the Capitol Police if they needed the help and then go from there. So that's one of the things that, that you see that they're changing rules and laws, and that the president can bring National Guard from other states into the district. And so the whole idea of threatening to restrict home rule in DC is sort of a, a canard, because we never had full autonomy anyway. And there's no way to really resist it. And the mayor's also taken grief for appearing to be kind of tolerant of the president's behavior, but she's not in a position where throwing down the gauntlet will help. And so she, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. She talked tough during his first administration, and we were all kind of cheering for her when she did the painted the street Black Lives Matter, and they set up the plaza, but at the end of the day, when Trump got his second term, he had a long memory. And so there was that sort of that delicate negotiation. And, there are people who wish she could have stood up more. And why didn't she fight back? And, you're not going to get what you want anyway, so you might as well just say what you want to say and take the hit. But the hit could have been a lot more severe than it has been. And, that's kind of part of the city's history. When I mentioned earlier, all the riots after King was shot and killed, and the riots started in DC. I remember the tear gas everywhere, schools closing down. And DC was not, when I was growing up, was not a majority Black city. And so there were a lot more white folks. The Hispanic community was kind of invisible. They were there, but they kind of were in small pockets in different neighborhoods. So you didn't see them as regularly, or they chose to be white, they chose to be Black, depending on, how they were perceived. But it changed DC as a city. It went from being sort of a small southern town to, a more federal city. The presence of the feds it became wider. I remember all of the law enforcement agencies in DC being given the power they had arrest power, basically. So there really was sort of a time when I think Washingtonians felt we were under, what's the phrase I'm looking for? It'll come to me, but that it was just a time when we had we were in sort of a military state, if you will. Before that, after the riots, President Johnson appointed a mayor, and I think he thought that would help calm things down. And he chose Walter Washington to be mayor. And Walter Washington was a friend of the business community. He was moderate at best, conservative, probably, in a more traditional way back then. Being a conservative wasn't necessarily a pejorative term back then. And so we had Walter Washington, and then once we could vote for mayor, he became the city's first elected mayor. And then we went on from there. And then over time, after the riots, I really did see that's when the city began to shift, because white people started moving to the suburbs. Like I said, I went to Catholic school, and my class when I got there was majority white. By the time I graduated, we were almost 50-50. And by the time, but the classes behind me were clearly far more Black. And so that's where you began to see the shift. By the time Marion Barry came along, um, he had been on the council, was well regarded for his business acumen, his ability to negotiate with people and all of that kind of stuff. And so, he did a lot of things to transform the city. And he also was responsible, I think, in large measure for the growth of the Black middle class in DC. And, he created a jobs program for youth. It was a summer program. And a lot of people will tell you that that was their first job, right? I was in the summer youth program and I got my job. And some of it was like, cleaning the streets and that kind of stuff, but it put money in your pocket. It gave you a sense of working and earning money and that kind of stuff, which was a first time for a lot of people. If you needed a job, he would help you get a job. And he wasn't one to take bribes, which was really interesting. I'll tell you about that in a sec. But he would, like, if you went and said, my brother needs a job, he'll say, what's your brother's name? And he'd write down the name. And he said, what does your brother do? And he'd write that down. And then he'd, on another piece of paper, he'd write down a name and a number and tear it off and give it to you and say, give this to your brother and tell him to call. Barry also had a reputation for looking out for the seniors. So there were a lot of activities and programs for senior citizens. And his thing was seniors vote more than anybody else. And kids are going to be voters someday. And so he, because Barry had an interesting background. He was a dissertation away from a PhD. And he studied, hard sciences like chemistry, physics, that kind of stuff. He was a science major in college. He had sort of the common touch, as politicians like to say. He could talk to anybody. And the business community really liked him. And, he was very strategic, surrounded himself with a lot of people who could get things done. And the Fed spent a lot of time trying to trap him and stuff, even after his infamous crack moment. And even with that, the clip that you would see on the nightly news really didn't tell the whole story, because the woman he was with that night had been a long time flame. And I don't know how or why the feds got her to go along with this, but they met in a hotel. And if you saw the whole thing, not the edited version, he was really trying to get busy quickly. Like, he came in, he was ready, he wanted the hugging and the kissing and all of that goes with it. And she was like, oh no, let's do this first. And he's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting like that? And she's like, well, I just want to do this. And he's like rolling his eyes and he's like, okay. And as soon as he lit the pipe, boom, the feds come in and they arrest him and stuff. Well, it turned out to be, the crime turned out to be a misdemeanor. So that meant that he was able to run for office again after he got out of jail. And he was overwhelmingly returned to office. And most people felt about him that the things that he did wrong were personal. He hurt himself. He didn't take money. He didn't take bribes from people. He didn't kind of, divert money from things for his own wealth. Because he lived in a modest house in Southeast DC. So after he got out of jail, he was the feds tried to set him up again. And so this time they had a woman approach him about she wanted to do business with the government and she wanted to have this conversation with them. But she wanted him to come and meet with her and a colleague at his farm in Virginia. And so what the feds were hoping would, if he accepted this bribe in Virginia, he would have crossed state lines, which would have made it a federal offense. Well, the day that they were supposed to meet at the farm, the woman's husband, who was a DC cop, got busted for they were both Asian, and he was assigned to Chinatown because there's still a fairly older Chinese community, and what's left of Chinatown is very small, for protection money. And he got busted that same day. And then after he got busted, it came out that he was married to this woman who Barry was supposed to meet with. And so, she canceled the meeting, and the whole thing, all of the truth kind of fell out. And so another time somebody showed up at one of his favorite spots. There was kind of a, bar and grill kind of place called Players Lounge over Southeast DC, which was anything but. You didn't have to be a player to be there. And if you were, you probably were a has-been. You were going to Players Lounge. But anyway, he was there, and this guy came and tried to offer him a bribe and put cash in a greasy paper bag and set it on the table in the middle of the conversation. And Barry just looked at him and said, "You must think I'm stupid," and got up and walked out and left the guy sitting there. So there were all kinds of attempts to get him to do something crooked, but that didn't happen. And then after he did another term as mayor, and then he eventually became the Ward 8 council member. And then he started having health issues, and, people were trying to find other jobs for him and things. But, his greatest vice was women, but he had the drug problem, but his real vice was women, and he was willing to do anything for this particular woman. And that really kind of proved to be his undoing. And if you saw the whole video, you would have seen that. But he did so much for the city, and so many people got, like I said, jobs because of him. And he really made a difference in DC kind of being the place to be.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, because you've talked so much about kind of the transitions that you've seen DC go through, and kind of how it's uniquely situated as this city that doesn't have the same kind of representation of other cities in the country. So can you talk about why journalism, local journalism, and Black journalism is important in DC, considering kind of the context that it lives in?
Well, it's a couple of things. One is when I was young, you didn't see a lot of Black folks on TV, or you didn't know who was Black writing for a newspaper because you never saw the bylines, right? I mean, you saw the byline, but you didn't know the person necessarily. And so for us growing up, to see a byline in the Washington Post or the Washington Star that belonged to a Black person was a big deal. To see somebody Black on TV was a big deal. So I think there was a sense of community trust, that and respect for people who could move beyond the Black press. But the Black press for many, many years continued to be the place where you felt like you got the true version of what was going on, right? So, we had the Afro. There was the Washington Afro. There were other papers, of course. The Afro doesn't have a DC edition anymore, but the Washington Informer, which was started by a former council member, Calvin Rolark, and his daughter Denise Rolark Barnes is now the publisher. Her after her father died, her stepmother ran the paper for a while, and then her stepmother became a council member in DC, and then Denise ran the paper, and still does. And so I think Black press, Black radio. I mean, Black radio when I was growing up was huge. That was a primary source of news and information that you felt you could trust. And so and it all kind of came with a what Tom Joyner liked to call a spoonful of sugar. He said, people can only take so much kind of down, depressing stuff. So you got to give them something that entertains as well. And it was you know explanatory journalism, I think, in a lot of ways, like what this means to this community. Um, but it also was a celebration. People who got promotions, people who were the first in their community to do certain things, to achieve certain things. You know, when the city had, beauty pageants for Black women. In fact, a schoolmate I was talking about, the moms and dads who we all knew growing up. One of the moms passed recently, and her funeral was Saturday. Um, she was the first Black Miss DC, and that was a big deal, right? And so, Black media was more than just getting a regular newspaper or hearing a radio show or something like that. It felt more familial, and I don't think people will tell you that's how they felt about reading the Post or the Star or the Washington Daily News when that existed, or the Washington Times. They were important to read because you needed lots of information. But if you really wanted to get the real lowdown, you were going to get the Black newspaper, you were going to get Jet and Ebony. That was on everybody's coffee table, right? And you would listen to the radio stations to see what was going on, because you figured you would get uh, uh, the real story. And I think ethnic newspapers have always been important. And I think in communities of color, that news is still important to really having a full perspective on what's going on. It's kind of like a translation service in a lot of ways. So I think that's really important. I started my career working for a Mutual Black Network, which later became Sheridan Broadcasting. And one of the interesting things about Mutual Black, the man who hired me, Paul Brock, was the news director at the time. He was an NABJ founder. And when after I got the job, I just remember, because it was owned, Mutual Black was owned by Mutual Broadcasting, which was like the largest radio network in the country, but they had separated so that they could get Black stations too. They created Mutual Black, but we shared content. So when we got interviews with, Jesse Jackson or Perrin Mitchell or any of the, Black politicians, in different parts of the country, Mutual used the content that we got. We did the interviews. I was a tape editor there. I edited the interviews. I wrote the lead-ins and the closes for as part of the newscaster's script. Just did a lot of that kind of stuff. Did interviews on my own. And all of that was content that was heard all around the country. But for those 100 stations or so that were part of Mutual Black, they listened to us on their stations, on Black stations or Black program stations around the country, to find out what was really going on with a piece of legislation, or what was coming down the pike in some other way with federal agencies and that kind of stuff. And we had some celebrity news, and we had some sports. I was a sports producer there for a while. So all of that was kind of part and parcel of how you lived. And when my son was young, we were still avid paper readers. And in fact, when I couldn't get him to go to sleep at night, I used to give him the newspaper. And of course, he'd fall asleep. I'd come up to check on him, and he'd be passed out. The newspaper would be on the floor, because he liked to lie on his stomach and read from the floor. And he got to the point where he was reading the paper before he went to school, and he'd be telling the teachers about stuff. And he knew all about this one crime that went on. We were living in the Twin Cities then. And his vice principal called me at work and asked me, because I guess the perpetrators of the crime, the guy who was sort of the ringleader, had been recruiting kids because they were juveniles, and he knew that they weren't going to get any heavy charges because back then, Minnesota had very little crime. And so they were recruiting middle school kids. And the vice principal called me and asked me if my son was being recruited by anybody because he seemed to know so much about what happened with this crime. And I'm thinking, that makes no sense at all, but okay. So she's going on telling me what he told her. And I said, did you read the paper this morning, by the way? And she said, oh, no, I didn't get a chance to. I said, look on page 1 below the fold and look at the bottom. And I said, the story is right there. I said, he read the paper this morning on his before school. They thought he had firsthand knowledge when what he had was
the paper. Dean Jones, I want to ask you a little bit about, I know you mentioned going to George Washington University, but when did your kind of interest in news begin? And did you know that's what you wanted to do when you got to college?
No. Most of my professional life has been pretty accidental. I wrote for the school paper in high school, and I kind of thought about maybe being a reporter, but I hadn't thought about it in really strong terms. I thought I'd go to law school, and till I got to undergrad and discovered that as much as I loved school up to that point, I hated college. And I thought, oh no, I'm not adding 3 years to this. That's just not going to happen. And I had to figure out what I was going to do. I really kind of floundered a bit in college. And I had started at Fordham University in New York, in the Bronx. And it wasn't working for me. So I dropped out middle of sophomore years, came home, got a job, and quickly realized that this wasn't going to work for me either, because the kind of jobs you would get without having a degree, they didn't pay well. They weren't satisfying. You just felt like a cog in the wheel. I didn't want to work for the government because so many people in my family had, and they never seemed to enjoy their jobs. So I had to figure out what I was going to do. And I had a really close friend we went all the way through school together pretty much. And she was going to come to Fordham until I decided I wasn't going to stay. And so she got into GW, and she said, transfer to GW. She said, they got a pretty decent program here. She said, and you're a DC resident, you'll get in. And because GW wasn't the powerhouse then that it is now. So I got accepted, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And, I'm taking my classes, and at some point I got to pick a major, right? And she said, well, why don't you think about journalism? She said, the major here isn't hard. You're a halfway decent writer. You'll get through, and at least you'll have that piece of paper. And I said, okay. So I changed my major to journalism. And then I wrote for the student paper, and my first story was god awful. The only thing I recognized the next day was my byline after they got through editing it. But, my friend stuck with me, and, she coached me through some stuff. And then I started writing and kind of getting the hang of it. And then I started liking it. And then I had a really good story. It was like a series really about how bad the food was. College students always complain about food, but then this stuff was bad. Somebody came to the newspaper office one day with this little saucer of asparagus, and it had twigs in it, and little pieces of twig. And when I called the food service manager, he said, some of our older cuts of asparagus have a wood-like consistency. That's a real quote. And so, once I put that in, people were bringing us, like, this one kid brought the asparagus in. And then after that, people were bringing us stuff. And they were like, going into the dining hall at this dorm, and, you're going to see how bad it is. And at the time, the undergraduate population at GW was largely Jewish. And there were days when none of the dining halls had any kosher meals. And sometimes the only entree was pork. And so if you had any kind of dietary restrictions, it was like, good luck. And freshmen had to be on the meal plan. And so I started writing about it. And then they were in negotiations with the staff in the dining halls. And this guy called and told us that they knew when the health inspectors were coming, that they were given all these, kind of tips on how to make the food look fresher than it was. If they had bad meat, they didn't want to get dinged for it, even if they were going to throw it out. So they used to throw Ajax uh, um, cleanser on it, and it would turn the meat pink, so it would look fresher than it was. And so, I mean, it was crazy. So anyhow, that took off, and I realized that, and so we found that the university was supposed to put out bids every so many years for the food service contract, and they had been using the same um, company for years without putting out the bids. And so, after that series of stories, they put out bids for new contract. The company that had the current contract changed their menu. So then there were vegetarian and kosher meals available. Once a month, they would do these fancy Sunday dinners. And the menu was like going to a fancy, buffet somewhere. The food got a whole lot better. And they settled the contract with the workers. And so I thought, man, you can do a story and change people's lives. I thought, now this is for me. And so that's how I really got into it. But I initially didn't have, plans to do that. When I started off, I didn't think I'd ever be an editor, and I became an editor. And that's kind of my whole, everything that I've done it was usually a departure from where I thought I was going.
Before we start talking about how you ended up in academia and teaching, I want to talk about Newsday and the Pulitzer Prize team that you were on um, for, I think it was a subway derailment story, if I'm
Mm-hmm.
remembering correctly. So,
Yeah.
so quickly, just give me the rundown of how you got from kind of your student newsroom there, and then tell me a little bit about what it was like being on that team, reporting in, was this David Dinkins era New York City?
Yeah, I was at New York Newsday. There were two Newsdays. There's Newsday, which is the sort of we used to call it the mothership, um, in Long Island. That was the main paper, but they started a New York edition, and I was hired to work for that. But anyway, I just kind of I went a lot of places, so I'm not going to take you through the laundry list of all of the places I worked. But when I got to Newsday, New York Newsday, I got there from Minneapolis. I was working in Minneapolis at the Star Tribune, and I got an offer at Newsday. So I went there, and I went as a copy editor, and then went into the Manhattan office as an assignment editor on the night desk. And that was a crazy period, because probably about a week or so before the crash, there had been this um, riot in Brooklyn, um, when in a Hasidic Jewish community, when well, I guess it was kind of between a Black community and a Hasidic Jewish community, but it was a, a, a Jewish man struck and killed a kid, hit him in a car accident. And there was a lot of tension between the communities anyway, and that kind of blew up into a whole thing. Um, and so we had reporters who had gone out and reported on that. And then the next week, this subway crash happens. And so um, what the story turned out to be ultimately was this motorman came to work totally blitzed and nodded off driving the train. And it ultimately went off the tracks, hit these pylons underground, and caused this big derailment. And people got, some people died, some people got hurt. He, however, ultimately walked away from the accident and went in a park across the street and watched as all these first responders came and watched all the chaos and stuff. And then he kind of sobered up and he got up and went home. And it took a while for the lead reporter on this. He was able to track the guy down and basically find out what happened. And I was an editor at that point. I was working on the night desk. And, but a lot of times, especially on the weekends, I worked a day shift on Saturdays. And so, the whole newsroom was doing a little bit of everything. We were reporting, we were editing, we were doing stuff. And my job initially was kind of doing all the other stuff that was going into the paper and not specifically working on a story. But the lead reporter would come and talk to me about where he was going. And he was trying to work around the clock, like he didn't even want to go to sleep. And because he was young and he lands on this is like the biggest story of his career, right? So, but we would talk about who are you talking to? What kind of questions are you going to ask? Where do you go? And so, he had the editor who was sort of in charge of running the daily coverage, but I was there at night. If something happened, if there was a breakdown on that level, I was the night editor. And so we built a really good rapport, and I was helping out with that as well. So the whole newsroom won the Pulitzer, wasn't just particular people. So, for years, I never even put it on my resume because I just thought, it's a group thing. It's not like Jackie Jones, won the Pulitzer Prize by herself. And people were like, but you were part of the team, so put it on there. But it was a story there was a lot going on in the immediate, but then the aftermath of the story is probably where I had kind of more influence because I was dealing with the reporters who were kind of picking up some of the pieces, kind of the cleanup pieces of it. But it was an exciting time in the newsroom, and it was an exciting paper to work for. So, the editors got real involved, and because the New York edition was relatively new, we were very competitive with the New York Post and New York Daily News. The New York Times, not so much, because they kind of, they had way more money than any of us put out a newspaper every day. But the Times too, to some degree. But we were, I think, because we were so focused on the external competition, there wasn't a lot of, infighting among the staff. We still get together. In fact, we had the 30th anniversary of the closing of the paper. Was last week. So every year we have we meet up in New York and have a reunion. It's like a real organized thing. We meet somewhere and have food, drink, the whole thing. But it was an exciting time to be in New York. Dinkins becoming the first Black mayor of New York City was a big deal. And there were a lot of people kind of gunning for him in a lot of ways. People who wanted to undermine him as a politician, people who wanted to paint him as ineffective. He made a couple of real mistakes. I think what really took him down was his failure to respond immediately when the towers got hit. He was at a meeting, and it was an important meeting for New York City, for trade and a number of things in Tokyo. And he didn't jump on the next thing smoking to get back to New York. I think that really kind of hurt him in the end. And then New York City and crime is always a complicated issue. And so Rudy Giuliani was a very effective DA, and I think was able to kind of play that crime card very well and ended up taking the city. And so that was that was when we all thought Giuliani was relatively okay. He was like a hero guy because he was able to uh, get to these gangs and get a lot of uh, mob bosses and all of that stuff through RICO statutes. And he was one of the first to use RICO laws in a very aggressive way. So it was a dynamic time in the city. There was lots of stuff going on, lots of stuff to cover. But I would say being in New York and being in Philly were probably some of the best years of my career. But that story was just, there was so many pieces to it, then when this guy sat down and started talking to our reporter about what he did that day, he started, drinking and smoking and snorting and whatever in the morning and basically got high and got drunk and stayed that way until he went to work that evening. And, in all of that chaos, trying to figure out where people, what happened to people, the communication failures with the radios. There were just so many pieces of it, but the idea that this guy was able to, he walked away from it and basically was just so out of it that I don't even know that he could feel remorse. That was a really intense, and we were largely working around the clock. So people were working shorter hours. You go home, basically take a nap, shower, change, come back in the office. And we worked that way for a couple of weeks. And so when we won the Pulitzer, our executive editor basically came through the newsroom around 7 or 8 o'clock, and he looked at the night desk and told us, he said, when y'all get off, come to the Lion's Head. And so, when we got done, when we closed the paper, we went down there and he threw his American Express card up on the bar and said, let them have whatever they wanted. And so we ate and drank and partied until the wee small hours. And when we came in that morning, he had sent out a message. So that meant back then, because it wasn't, email was not what it is today. Oops. You there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I lost the picture. Anyhow, he sent us all a note and said, if there were a Pulitzer for partying, we would have won that too. So
Yeah. So now I'm being cognizant of our time and the fact that there's so much to get to and just not enough time in one oral history. But give me kind of the breakdown of how you ended up transitioning from being in the newsroom to teaching.
I was at the Washington Post, and I had been for a number of years the National Association of Black Journalists representative to the Accrediting Council on Education and Journalism and Mass Communications. It's an organization that grants accreditation to schools of journalism and mass comm. And it had been a very white organization for a very long time. And it was, there we are. And so I got to know one of the organization's leaders, who at the time was a dean at Penn State. And he was trying to get me to come back and finish my my graduate degree at Penn State. But at the time, I just couldn't afford to go back to school. I was back in DC, looking out for my mom. My brother had had a series of health issues. I was looking out for him. His wife was very ill at the time with cancer. And, I just told the dean, I said, look, I can't just quit and go to grad school right now. I need a paycheck. And so, yeah, maybe a little less than a year later, he came to me and offered me a job as a senior lecturer at Penn State. And I didn't have to really interview for it. I didn't have to go before a committee. This was the hiring lectures was discretionary money for the dean in the College of Communication. So he offered me the job, and I took it because I wasn't happy at the post, and I'll spare you that. But I just thought this was a good move at the time. So I went and I spent 3 years at State College, and then which I liked a lot. But in the meantime, I had started seeing someone here in DC, and I thought this was going somewhere that it ultimately didn't go. But I moved back to DC to be with him, and I started working for myself. I became a career coach, and I did a lot of freelance work, and I ended up writing for blackamericaweb.com. And so I kind of cobbled all of that into real work. And then um, I was teaching at Howard part-time. And I just didn't like that either, and decided I wasn't going to teach there anymore. And I was like, I'm through teaching. I am never teaching again. I'm not going to see the inside of a classroom. These students these days. Blah, blah, blah. So then Dwayne Wickham, who I'd known for a long time through NABJ, was named dean of the New School of Global Journalism and Communication. Well, they didn't even have a name at that point. He had been hired to create a school of journalism and mass comm at Morgan. And I had sent him a note and said, this is great news. You're from Baltimore. This is going to be a great opportunity. This is perfect for you. It's your hometown, but it's going to be great for the students, because I knew the work he had done at North Carolina A&T, where he ran an institute for journalism education, and it was very successful. And so I just thought, I said, if you ever need, if there's something I can do to help, let me know. So they called me up and he said, I'd like to hire you as a consultant because of your expertise on accreditation issues. And, you'll come up to campus periodically and you'll help us, as we plan what this new school is going to look like, how it could be day one on track to reach accreditation on his first try. And so I said, okay. So then I'm figuring, I'll go up on a regular basis, maybe for a year or two, get them started, and then go off and do whatever I was going to do next. And then 2 weeks before school started, the year that Dwayne arrived in 2012, he called me and he said, I just had a professor quit on me. Can you teach a couple of classes for me? So I said, okay. So then I taught the classes, and I sat on the committees, sat on one of the committees that he had formed to figure out how he wanted to approach the program. So he brought in professionals and academics from other schools and worked with his faculty. And we talked about what the curriculum was going to look like and, kind of the rules of the road and all of that stuff. Dwayne got the approval for the school from the state in less than a year, which nobody thought he was going to be able to do when he arrived. And so once the school was approved, he asked me if I would stay and be the inaugural chair of the Department of Multimedia Journalism. And so I agreed. And I've been there ever since, and didn't think I'd be there long. And here I am in my 13th year at Morgan and in my 5th year as dean. So when he decided to step aside, he now runs our Center for New Media Strategic Initiatives, which is largely our documentary unit at the university. And he is incredibly productive and has, a team of student fellows who work with him, and he produces all kinds of stuff. And we won a regional Emmy this year for a documentary he did on the history of Morgan. And he's working on like 2 or 3 things at one time. And whenever I talk to him, he's updating me on the progress of of what he's doing. The school itself, we have almost 400 students. We have 3 departments: multimedia journalism, multi-platform production, and strategic communication. Journalism, interestingly enough, is the largest of the 3, which is unusual these days, because when you go visit schools of journalism and mass comm, strategic communication, PR, advertising, those programs are usually larger than journalism. And so there's, that's distinctive. We have that global in our name, and we take that very seriously. We've taken students to work on projects in Cuba and France and in the Caribbean, other parts of the Caribbean, and we've had partnerships with other universities, including Penn State and Brigham Young University and Howard. And we do a lot of collaborative stuff. We're increasingly doing more projects with other units on campus. We're really working to try to grow the program. We rely heavily on a lot of grant money because Morgan has about almost 12,000 students now, which is amazing growth from when I first arrived, where I think maybe we had a little more than half that. But we've also been fortunate. Everybody knows that the university's gotten money from Mackenzie Scott, but the president wisely put that money into an endowment so that there would be money in perpetuity. When he got the first money from Mackenzie Scott, his then CFO said, "Look, you got $40 million this year, but can you raise $40 million next year or the year after that or the year after that? If you just go and you wipe out people's debt, you give everybody a raise, you do all," he said, that money could be gone and then you got nothing to follow it. And so the president put a big chunk into the endowment, and then money for some new programming and a few other things. And then this latest round of money, he put 95% of that into the endowment. And a student asked him, why didn't you just give that money to the students? Because we got all this loan debt. He said, I thought about that, but if I paid off everybody's debt this year, then what's left for the students who are coming and need money to go to school? Yeah, I have to think about that. So part of the money that he didn't put in the endowment, he gave to enrollment management so that it could work with students who needed funding to stay in school. And so, I think that Morgan has been creative on a lot of levels. Its brand is growing. And so this is a good time to be there. We've done some pretty good things. We've got, we have a Center for the Study of Race and Culture in Sports, which has credentials to cover the World Cup next year. They spent the summer doing some games and some coverage for the FIFA Championship Series, which was aimed at kind of helping promote the World Cup to Americans, to get them to turn out. We did several years ago, we did a study on the images of Black females in sports and how they've been treated and how they are often perceived impacts a decision of whether you're going to play collegiate or professional sports, and kind of what that meant. And what was then the Undefeated at ESPN gave us a grant to produce the study. And then out of that, they did a series of stories, which won some awards. They did a 30 by 30, documentary on Black women in sports. And they also commissioned a song. So, it was really cool. It was a nice little hip hop song called Undefeated. And they had female students from a small university, and it you have to go and just kind of go online and check it out. But it was a heady time for us to kind of, get that grant. And we've been working on another project that we hope to have finished soon. And I don't know if Anscape will want it now, but they gave us the money for it, and we produced the study. So we'll see where that goes. We have a Center for Urban Journalism, which is led by Leonard Pitts, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning a journalist for many years with the Miami Herald. And he's, basically looking at local issues and how they are impacted in the community. We have I wanted to link all of our student media so that we are, so that we kind of have that outreach that, when you think about Black media, right? We were talking about that earlier. So we have WEAA, which is our NPR affiliated radio station. We have a student training program so that students could come and work as journalists, as audio producers. They can work with our underwriting department in, getting community outreach programs done, and also in getting some financial support for the station. And that's all under the guise of the school. We have Bear TV, which is the student staff. The TV station has a YouTube channel. And so we're working on improving the programming for that, and having a regular newscast there, just like we do with the radio station. And then the spokesman is the student publication. And the idea is for us to be able to share the content, and as our students learn to write and edit across all those platforms. So by the time you graduate from Morgan, my goal is have a diploma in one hand and a job in the other. But also we're feeding the beast, as it were, because we know our community needs the information. So you write for the spokesman, you write, edit, produce, broadcast for WEAA. You do the same thing for Bear TV. We have the strategy shop, which the strategic communication majors primarily work at, and they have clients on campus and externally. So those students learn to do, marketing campaigns and PR ad campaigns, and they work for an intern with, nonprofits, with government agencies, with small and large agencies. And so the goal is everybody knows how to do a little bit of everything by the time they graduate. So that's basically what we're doing in a nutshell.
Yeah. I had the privilege of interviewing a current student and also a more kind of recent graduate when we were at WEAA a couple of weeks ago, and that is something that they talked about kind of the interconnectedness of student media, and specifically kind of what the training program looks like at WEAA. I'm wondering if you can speak specifically to the way that you've seen the radio station evolve at during your time at Morgan.
I think, in some ways it's kind of going back to the roots, because when WEAA was founded, it really was a community station. I mean, students lobbied to get a radio station, and got the university to agree. As you probably know, Representative Kwesi Mfume, who is a Morgan alum and is the chair of the Board of Regents for the university, was one of the co-founders of WEAA, and he was the first programming director for the station. And a lot of people from the community came and volunteered. There were folks who were on WEAA for years who never earned a dime. They just came and they did their shows, and kind of, I think people who used to listen to WEAA a long time ago still look at us that way. There's kind of like that homey, friendly, a reliable source for news and information and good music. And people will tell me, oh yeah, I know WEAA. I listen to them all the time. And then when you talk to them a little longer, they haven't listened in a long time. And they couldn't tell you what, they could name some people they knew back in the day, but they don't, don't realize how much the station has changed. So now you got more paid folks. But we do spend a lot of time trying to balance that news and public affairs and music. I mean, on a Saturday morning when Robert Shaheed opens that mic at 5 a.m., the lines are already lit up with people wanting to make requests. And then we have a Larry Lancaster and Mike Nice, aka Mike Middleton, our operations director. They have a show, an oldie show, but it's more hip hop, early rap oriented. But those shows are popular. They really take people back to the day, and they really, I know where I was when this song hit, kind of thing. And so that kind of stuff is wildly popular. We have Caribbean news on Saturday afternoons, or even we have a music show, the Fiesta Musical. And then Sunday is gospel all day. We made a change in the lineup a couple of years ago, and that was a non-Christian program that just wasn't making, and so we decided that we were going to drop the show and move on to something else. And the president asked me if there was any plan to change Gospel Grace or any of that Sunday programming. And I said, no, sir, not unless you're planning to leave town as soon as you do it, because we're going to be run out of here on the rails. So, that's wildly popular. Dr. K and her public affairs programming, her show is wildly popular. We've got a great mix of things. And we are really trying to turn the news operation there into something more directly engaging to the community. We have a pretty good webpage. We've invested in that. We have, the Morgan News Hour, which is the, student newsletter. I'd like to really see us grow to build a team of students who are out reporting and doing more live stuff than, jumping on the phone and interviewing some folks for cut-ins for stories that come from the wires or elsewhere. But it's a growing thing. When I arrived, if we had 5 kids in a semester working for the station, that was a big deal, regardless of the role they were playing. Now we often have anywhere from 15 to 20 students working in some capacity in the student learning lab. And so that's real satisfying. Mikkel Hunter, who does her show is more neo soul and, a little community news on the side and interviews and stuff. She has become our student intern trainer. And so she really is working with the students to develop on multiple levels, including, going a little heavier with news that can be used throughout the day on different programs. And so, there's a lot happening that we weren't doing before. The spokesman this year is doing a series on cancer on campus. Mm. There was a story that ran in the Post back in the spring, I think, that said that while cancer rates were leveling off for people in 50 and older, it was increasing in young people. And then we found out that there were students on campus and students in our program who are cancer survivors, or who have had a sibling or someone close to them in their peer group who have either succumbed or are cancer survivors. And so we've been working on a series of stories that not only do we want to post on the spokesman's site, but posted on WEAA and reported on Bear TV. And so the idea is to again, write across platforms and create across platforms. We've got students working on a podcast, developing podcast series. So we're trying to stay current with whatever the technology is for news and information, music production, all of that stuff. And we also have a lot of students who are interested in entrepreneurship. And so we're working on that. We're going to do more stuff with data journalism and AI. We've got an AI course coming up in the spring, and how to use it effectively and ethically. So we're there. We're all over it as best we can be, and always looking for an opportunity to work with others.
Yeah. And so, kind of today, I've heard you talk about living and working all over the country in newsrooms, in different institutions. I'm wondering if you can speak to what makes Morgan and the School of Global Journalism and Communication there special and unique in the way that it serves its students in the greater community.
Good question. I think in a lot of ways, Morgan still has a familial pull. Our alumni, just university wide, are incredibly loyal, and they're and active. We really work in the school to know our students and to make sure when you come in. I hate to lose a student. I hate to see somebody drop out. I hate to see somebody just leave the program. And you might really want to be an architect, and there's nothing wrong. We have a great architecture program. But if you come in as one of our majors, I want to keep you. I told the students last year, at an assembly, I said, if you graduate from this school and I don't know who you are, we're small enough that if we graduate maybe 40, 50 students a semester, if I don't know who you are when you're walking across that stage, then somehow I have failed you. Because I ought to know you, I ought to recognize your name, I ought to know something about you. And I worked really hard at that. And so I told the freshmen, I said, you better make sure I know you so that by the time you walk across the stage, I can shake your hand and call you by name. And it's not just because I just heard somebody call it out. And so they took me to heart. And, for a couple of weeks there, I was getting like these knocks on the door, and I'd open the door and they said, well, you said that we should come to know you. So I just came to introduce myself. I am. And that went on for a while. So I was glad they listened. I just think, and our students are good about helping each other. We bring alumni back to talk to students about what's out there. And I really go for recent alums so that this is the kind of job you're most likely to get when you get out of here, and what you have to do to be prepared for that and what's coming. I always ask them to tell the students what they did that they found particularly useful, what they wish they had paid more attention to, and then to tell us as the administrators what they wished they had while they were going here and what they think students are going to need going forward so that we can adapt. So we're always looking at our curriculum. Are we giving everybody enough? And then just trying to create programs where we can't teach it as a course. Maybe we can bring in some expert speakers and do a workshop or something like that. We had a course this fall. We have an investigative reporting course, but we entered a consortium project with Howard because Nicole Hannah-Jones from their Center for Journalism and now I'm blanking out. Journalism and anyway, Nicole teaches the investigative reporting class, and so we had students in that class this year. We joined that program, and so we are always looking for those kind of opportunities. They've got somebody there who does data journalism who will be coming to teach in the spring. And so we like I said, we bring in speakers, we take students, with us on our travels so that they get used to going places. They really, and once people meet our students, they really like them. We have a student, Journey Burris, who interned for Tavis Smiley this summer for working with their White House correspondent. And he asked to meet me, for over coffee. We met up and he said, "You got any more at home like her? Because if you do, I'll hire all of them." And so, that makes you feel good, right? When one of your students is that doing that well. And so we are we have an NABJ chapter, student chapter, and we have a really very assertive young man who is the president of the chapter and is really revitalizing it in a lot of ways. And he's setting up events where they go and visit news organizations and get some exposure so that they may have a shot at getting an internship or a job when they get out. We try to place people places that we haven't had interns before, or getting people in programs. And so, I think that exposure does good for students, but it also does good for people who hire, because they know that we've got strong people that they ought to be bringing into their newsrooms or, their ad spaces or PR companies or whatever it is that our students want to do. There's an opportunity there. And we're also exposing them to entrepreneurs too, because at some point you're going to want to put all this together for your own purposes. And everybody's not meant to work for somebody. Somebody's got to be the boss, right? So why not you, if you really feel that's what you want to do? So I'm happy with the progress we're making, but I'm never satisfied.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to ask, kind of over the course of your career, starting out as a reporter, becoming a leader, an editor in the newsroom, and then a leader in the kind of academic space of journalism and mass communications, kind of what have you learned about yourself as a person through kind of your ability to take on all of these roles?
Hmm. I think in some ways I proved to be smarter than I thought. I was very content being sort of the number two or the helper. I didn't need to be in charge of anything. I was very content with that. And then when I would get these jobs, it was like, oh, okay, I can do this, and didn't mean that it all went smoothly, but that I could do it. So that kind of built up my self-confidence. One is that I really do love journalism. It's really important to me, and important that we do it right and that we set the table so that the students understand that if you're going to do this, be serious. It's not about being famous. It's not about making a lot of money, although all of that's nice too. I'm not discouraging anybody from that. But I think that what I want the takeaway for them to be is that if you do your job well, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, some benefit is going to accrue. And so that all of that stuff will take care of itself if you are doing what you're supposed to do. And it may not come right away. You might have to move somewhere else, or you might have to try something else in order to get there, but you can do it if you're serious about it. And I see that happen time and time again where students started off. I had a student who just went off and did something else when she graduated because she just thought it's too hard finding something. And then after a while, she just kind of kept taking sort of these communication adjacent jobs and then circled back to journalism. And I said, all experience is good and useful if you take it that way. And so I had to learn that. And as I told you, a lot of what I ended up doing was kind of accidental. It's not where I thought I was going. But I just learned that just sticking to it and doing your job and learning that all of that's going to pay off for you in some way down the road. And clearly it has. I certainly didn't expect to be in the academy for 13 years. But here I am. And so, the places I moved, I didn't think when I was a reporter, I didn't expect to be an editor. When I was an editor, I didn't think about being a top editor. I just kind of hunkered down and did the job. And then it all, started to fall into place. And so now I've got to think, how many more years am I going to do this? And I haven't made up my mind yet. But, what's next? And I often tell people that had I known when I was much younger that I would get to be in my 70s and have energy and still have something to give the industry and be able to help others, I probably would have paced myself a little differently. I think when you're young, you think you got to do everything before you turn 30, because we all know when you turn 30, you're ready for the old folks home. And then you get closer to 30 and you're like, oh, there's still so much to do. I'm young. I'm energetic. I'm not my grandma. And so you just kind of learn to just kind of keep pushing. And now I look at my friends who some are choosing to, some are being pushed out because of age, but their minds are still sharp. There are things that they can do. And so I think that we have to make sure that we have older folks still fighting to be in the game, that our interests are important, that there is that the way news and information is presented is accessible in multiple ways for people. I had this back and forth with somebody on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago about, she basically said, legacy journalists are crying in their beer because they can't move as quickly as younger journalists and news influencers, and who are posting constantly and they're breaking news and blah blah blah. And I was like, they're not always breaking news. What they're doing is breaking the news to other people who don't read the news. So they're reading the news. So they really are. They're reading different sites. They're not actually. They often are not, let me put it that way, they often are not reporting the news themselves. They're telling you this person got shot or this person got signed this big contract or whatever. So they are sort of, they gather the news, and compile it and put it out there. And so they're constantly posting, and, people are asking questions and they go and find out and they post it, which is fine. There's a place for that. But to tell me that there's going to be no place because of the speed of the technology, there's no place for a long form story, or that people don't want the details. Of course they do. Because when you're reading a story, there's always links embedded in the story to take you to somewhere else if you want to know more. So I just want there to be clarity about, what I'm reading, but I'm also fighting still for the format to not be, tossed out with the trash. I think that people are not going to read newspapers like I read newspapers. I had 3 or 4 newspapers coming into my home growing up, but I do read I read 2 newspapers every day, the paper, and I read online and all of that, and I watch TV and but that's because I'm a news junkie. But there are people who want to read it in the newspaper. They don't want it coming at them all the time. People are talking about going back to magazines because it's compact, it's easy to slip in your bag. It's not as cumbersome to read as a newspaper, a broadsheet newspaper particularly. But sometimes you just want that kind of tangible, that I still listen to terrestrial radio. My phone is for my web directions, and I don't need anything else cutting in the middle of that. And not every, people listen to music differently. They don't listen to radio the same, although I must say, except for Black radio, we still listen to the radio. Black people are listening, and they like that interaction with the host, and they want to know, and I don't see that in other communities. Penn State University shut down its radio station, WPSU. But we're still listening to Radio One and all of its affiliated stations, right? I remember Kathy Hughes when she was Kathy Liggins, and she had an AM radio station in DC, right? And so I watched her build her empire, and I see where she is now. But I also remember back when, and that was, That was our Wheaties for breakfast, man, was listening to the radio. That was the first thing you did in the morning. You had your music, you had your news, you had your traffic, your weather, all of that in one place. We had our favorite stations, we had our favorite DJs, we had all of that. And there's a place for that for those who want it. And I resent being told that as a senior citizen, there's only one format I got to get with, or I'm just too old to be given anything. And you're not going to keep me from being involved with knowing what's going on in my community. And I'm not going to, I think that we have to fight for that, because it's important that people get news and information the way they need it so they can absorb and access it. I have a former student who is working with, he's focused on accessibility journalism, like what you can hear, how you hear it, the things that you can do. And this was news to me that we had that the font that we use, that some people don't read it all the same way. So there's a whole thing there. I think there was a story last week about one of President Trump's cabinet members ordered that the typeface for their website and for official documents be changed from Arial to New Times Roman. And because New Times Roman is more official and what you see traditionally see government documents printed in, but Arial is an easier font to read, especially for people who have a harder time distinguishing between lettering and lowercase, so an L and an I is clearer in Arial than it is in New Times Roman. And so things like that seem petty, but it can make a difference for somebody who is, who wants to be informed, but is struggling to read it online. And so we need to be in the mix for that. I think that it's real important that Black people particularly pay attention to those issues, because we all have them too. And it's funny when you're talking about it in sort of the, one-off kind of story. But when you think about the impact it has on who gets news and information, who gets to be informed, then, that expands the definition of diversity. And we ought to be a part of that, because if you've got family members losing their vision, or you've got somebody whose hearing is impacted, or the way we absorb information. And this was the other thing. The platform that you use doesn't serve everybody. So those of you who read on your phones and that's easy, you can do everything by the phone. That's a particular skill for you, but everybody doesn't have it. Some people use their pads. Some people want paper. Some people, there's something for everybody. Everybody should be able to get it. Whatever gets you informed, keeps you up to date on what's going on in your neighborhood, your community, what's happening in the nation and the world, all of that. We all absorb it differently. And, you just don't think about, you just think it's another device for seeing what everybody else sees, but everybody doesn't see and hear it the same way. And I think that we are in a space where we can be at the forefront of what's next, because Black folks already know what it's like to be left out. So we need to make sure that we're not only getting in front, but we're taking everybody with us who we can.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that insight. And there's obviously so much more that I could ask you if we had all the time in the world, but I know we've been talking for a couple of hours. But last thing before we close, I just want to ask if there's anything that we didn't get to talk about that you think is particularly important to mention here, kind of your last morsel to leave everyone with.
Wow. I'm not going to take you down that rabbit hole. Because I could go on about ethics, and I could go on about, how we choose stories and not fall prey to, I guess that's my last nugget, that once you know how to report and you know how to consume the news, that, you ask the questions. Don't be, as a consumer, don't be hesitant to say, hey, I didn't get enough information about this. Where is this? And now you have the tools that allow you to reach out to somebody that way. But as a journalist, look at the information you're given and think about whether you got everything you need to tell the story. Because people don't talk to us because they like us and they just, want to tell us stuff. They talk to us because there's something for them to gain by having their story told. And people are working really hard to manipulate the story so that we tell it the way they would like it to be told. And as a journalist, our role is to look at it in a dispassionate way and figure out what the story really is and just lay it out there for people to make their own decisions about whether it's good, bad, or indifferent.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.